just happened to be the right place, the right time, had the right background.
And he had this burning desire. He still got it. And I don't understand it, because I would have given up long ago, personally.
A tattoo of what we are. The numbers down below is my hall number.
I remember Seattle, a rediscovery of what made us one of America's most livable cities, told by the people who saw it change, who made it change. I Remember Seattle is hosted by Lowell Deo. Our commentator is historian Walt Crowley. Our guest is former Port Commissioner Jack Block, who remembers the growing pains on the Seattle waterfront.
The first recorded business transaction in Seattle's history occurred on December 9, 1851, when members of the pioneer Denny Party cut trees along Alki Beach for sale to a passing ship bound for San Francisco. Maritime commerce has been the foundation of Seattle's economy ever since. Most of the Denny Party relocated to the eastern shore of Elliott Bay in the spring of 1852, and they donated land to Henry Yesler for construction of Puget Sound's first steam-powered sawmill that fall. By the 1870s, Seattle was exporting lumber, coal, salmon, and other goods all along the West Coast and to Hawaii and beyond. Next came the railroads, which built new piers and wharves and laid tracks on a planked railroad avenue, later filled in to create today's Alaskan Way. The railroad's monopoly control of the waterfront irked Seattle's growing labor and progressive movements in the early 1900s. After a bitter campaign, King County voters approved creation of the Port of Seattle in 1911 to place the waterfront under public ownership and management. Jack Block, a longtime member of the Port of Seattle Commission, and other veterans of the waterfront joined Lowell Deo to remember the hard work, innovations, and often bitter battles that have shaped Seattle's maritime heritage.
I once called it the armpit of the waterfront. People were afraid to come down here. They wouldn't walk down here.
But Jack Block isn't afraid to walk down here. He's seen Seattle's waterfront transform in just a few decades.
So was this place really run down?
Yeah, it was falling in the bay. It was just
How run down are we talking about? We're talking about dirty, we're talking rats?
dirty, yeah, rats, and God, it was just open sewers, running right into the bay. The docks had the toilets would drain right into the water.
So now when you look and you see things like the trolley there and all these joggers here and people enjoying ice cream cones, you got to feel good about that.
I do. You know, for a long time, people wouldn't even come down to this area. They were afraid to make from Ivers down. It was just too scary.
Many credit Block for helping make Seattle's seedy waterfront scenic.
These container ships, it was just the beginning of a revolution.
But in this story of technological advancements, urban development, and labor unrest, you're going to see how the tide turned against one of the port's biggest shapers, and why some consider former Port Commissioner Jack Block a villain.
Oh, he's got lots of enemies. You can't possibly be on the port of Seattle without making enemies. There is no way.
Critics call him controversial. Friends prefer to call him a visionary. But all agree Jack Block is largely responsible for the look of the Seattle waterfront.
Eyes the boys that build the boat, and eyes the boys that sail there, eyes the boys that catch the fish, and take some home to lie. Sarge the rings to cover your flick, cake and deep for on their codfish in the swing of the year, Friday make it bar.
It's a fairy tale story of how a second-generation longshoreman moved up the Union ranks to become a port commissioner. Only this fairy tale doesn't have the happy ending.
And you wanted to be a part of this? You wanted to be on the commission? Why?
Well, I grew up on the waterfront. When I was a kid, my dad would bring me down on the ships, and I'd go fishing here with my buddies. We'd play all around the docks. It was just a lot of fun. Good time to grow up during the Second World War. Got a little rock crowd.
In many ways, destiny seemed to pick Jack out for a life on the waterfront, beginning with his father in the Depression. Work was hard to come by, yet Jack's father didn't find work on the port. It found him.
He happened to campaign for another candidate for the port, and this fellow won. So on the basis of that, he got a job at the port. At that time, the port had its own stevedore or longshore gangs. That was before the unions. And so he became a longshoreman for the Port of Seattle. And right after that, they went out on strike. That was in '34. And I was born at the end of the '34 strike.
And what did your dad say about this line of work for you? Did he want this for you?
No. He said, my son will never work in the waterfront. He's going to go to college and make something out of himself.
At first, the teenager obeyed. But when this summertime gas station attendant looked toward the pier, he saw something he couldn't resist. The chance to make nearly twice the wages.
Stowing 100-pound sacks. That was an arduous job. You did it for 8 hours. Of course, there was coffee breaks and lunch breaks. But at the end of an 8-hour day, packing 100-pound sacks, you felt like you'd done a day's work.
It was tough work, literally backbreaking, but Jack loved the thrill.
They'd start a ship and they wouldn't come home till the ship was finished. Maybe 2 or 3 days. They'd sleep out on the job.
So how did your dad find out?
Well, he caught me. I was out at Pier 88. That's where the new Immunex building is out. And somebody recognized me. I was unloading barrels of tallow from a boxcar. He came out and I just caught him out of the corner of my eye watching me. And they were pretty heavy barrels.
Did you drop them?
No, I was doing it. I had a barrel truck, but I was breaking them back and everything. And I heard him laughing. So then he came over and said, don't tell your mother.
Jack went on to earn a degree in international trade from the University of Washington, but his passion for the work kept pulling him back to the port.
I was always, block's kid, the youngest guy on the block, no pun intended, but I was the youngest guy, working off the floor, and I was the youngest guy I was one of the first crane operators in Seattle, and the youngest foreman on the Pacific Coast at one time.
Jack became an active member of the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union. Still, his dream job wasn't so dreamy.
Well, I had some ideas, and I was complaining about not having adequate facilities. Somebody said, why don't you run for the port? So I said, okay, I will.
Soon, the young dockworker gained enough support in a bid for management. He lost, but voters elected the outspoken longshoreman to the Port Commission in 1973. This out-of-the-box thinker immediately started thinking in the box.
Cargo had been carried in bulk form since the beginning of time, so this was a major evolution when they started putting cargo into containers. Many persons that had been in the business just couldn't adapt to the new concept. They said it would never happen.
In the early 1960s, a simple steel box revolutionized international trade. The containers offered secure, dry storage of cargo and controlled climates. But containerization came with a price.
The hard manual labor was replaced by mechanization. And the employers were empowered to introduce any and all technological advancements in the handling of cargo.
But in the new technology, Jack Block saw a tremendous potential benefit for Seattle.
Ship for Alaska probably load about 12 ports. And he just a big haystack, a pile of cargo. He'd work 5, 6, 7 days to load a ship, night and day. Of course, we had shifts then. We were working 10-hour shifts. And then along came the container, and everything just happened overnight. And this port, fortunately, stuck their neck out and built a terminal over at Pier 18, and that was the beginning of it.
But what good are containers and the bigger ships if Seattle ports couldn't handle them? Jack and the commission realized they'd have to invest millions in the cranes you now see dotting the waterfront.
If we buy them, let's get the biggest ones we can. the same size, and we did, and that's what you see there.
And how big are they?
They'll go 22 wide. See this first crane here with the boom down? That's a second generation crane.
Are there any in the world bigger?
Not any bigger than that baby.
These are the biggest in the world?
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
The evolution goes on. So each year the vessels get bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's more mechanization, more automation, and we have to adjust accordingly. And it does have an effect on labor, specifically the longshoremen, because mechanization eliminates a lot of jobs.
Mechanization made business cheaper and more efficient for the shipping companies. It also made the longshoremen's job easier and less dangerous. But the unions had to sacrifice some jobs in exchange for higher pay and benefits.
The change in the industry brought on by mechanization was not entirely popular with all of the members of the Longshore Union. The contracts that made that change were narrowly approved, largely on the basis of confidence in the judgment of the Longshore leadership.
This workforce here, at one time, there were 4,500 longshore workers on the Seattle waterfront. I'll bet there aren't 500 now.
Today, the Port of Seattle and the union seem to have found a balance. The port employs more than 89,000 people, including longshoremen, freight transportation workers, and staff at SeaTac Airport.
Longshoremen, that is, men and later women who work alongshore, organized one of Seattle's first unions in 1886. They were in the thick of the city's famous general strike, which grew out of a shipyard dispute in February 1919. That shutdown ended peacefully after a few days, but the West Coast waterfront strike of 1934 was a very different matter. The coastal walkout pitted the members of what became the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union not only against shipping companies, but also against the rival International Brotherhood of Teamsters. It became a personal struggle between two labor titans, longshore leader Harry Bridges, an Australian-born Marxist, and the Teamsters' Dave Beck, a Seattle-based advocate of a more business-friendly unionism. The strike closed every port from San Diego to Bellingham on May 9, 1934, and Seattle Mayor Charles Smith mobilized the police to try to reopen local piers. Private security guards killed a Seattle striker, Shelby Daffron, near Richmond Beach on June 30, and two strikers died in a San Francisco confrontation on July 3rd, now known as Bloody Thursday. 6 days later, a citizen deputy was shot dead during a brawl with strikers in downtown Seattle. The longshoremen finally accepted a federal arbitration package on July 23rd, which granted most of their demands and laid the foundation for the historic National Labor Relations Act of 1935. The FBI would hound Harry Bridges for decades to come as a suspected Communist Party member. But it was Dave Beck who ultimately ended up in prison for tax evasion.
Life at the ports was anything but harmonious before the unions came on the scene. Longshoremen had to deal with hellish working conditions.
Basically, there were scab environments where people would go and come to the waterfront, and the employers would pick them, and there was a lot of corruption, a lot of payoff who was getting picked, and people during the histories of the late 19th century protested and wouldn't go to work. There's some very good accounts of that people organized, and the first thing they did was just not go down to that shape-up. And basically this was one of the first organized waterfront unions in the Port of Seattle.
The 1934 strike marked a significant turning point in the history of the labor movement in Seattle and across the nation.
The 34 waterfront strike and the Minnesota Teamster strike, which took place relatively close, were the first wage increases in the Depression, which began to turn the economy around.
At the forefront of the 34 strike, how workers were hired.
The labor movement was pretty unique at that time. In the 33 and 32, there was a lot of strife on the Pacific Coast, up and down all the ports. And Harry Bridges came along and organized the union and took everybody out on the strike. And they wanted a hiring hall. They wanted to do their own dispatching, do away with the shape-up. And that's where everybody would stand outside a dock and the boss would pick out his favors.
Workers devised a simple name board and rotating peg system to fairly divide the work. Longshoremen now took turns going out.
The heart of the original Longshore contract and concept was the equal division of work. Nobody has a steady job that he goes to. If there's only 600 hours worth of work, then you divide it up so everybody gets 3.
One principle since then to the present, and they fight every time with the employer over, is the right to go out in rotation. This union founded the concept of the one with the lowest wages goes out first.
But the pegboard isn't the only mark of the 34 strike. Coastal confrontations broke out with police, leaving 7 Seattle strikers dead, including Shelby Daffron, a Seattle longshoreman and delegate to the Northwest Strike Committee. A clash also killed King County Sheriff's Deputy Steve Watson during a melee downtown. You can still see a memorial to those workers in the Evergreen Washelli Cemetery in North Seattle. These trees mark the graves of the 41 workers who have since died while working on the waterfront. But the strife from the 34 strike wasn't in vain. When the dust settled, workers found they had greater strength. They had the guarantee of rank-and-file control. They also had the power to form a formidable union, Seattle's Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union, Local 19.
In 1948, they abolished the Waterfront Employers Association, established the Pacific Maritime Association, put in new officers, and a period of labor relations became peaceful.
In 1950, advancing technology, or mechanization, became more of an enemy to union men.
The job has become less collective. I mean, when we started out, there was 8 to 12, sometimes 16 men in the hole, depending on how much work there was, and we all were dependent, each one on the other.
By 1971, the technology of containerization took center stage in contract negotiations. When talks broke down, West Coast longshoremen held the longest strike in U.S. history.
Actually, it was a defeat for us in the sense that it established, in particular in Seattle, it established the employer's right to have steady men, something that the Longshore Union had opposed from 1934 on.
For the next 30 years, unprecedented prosperity helped keep the peace on the waterfront. In 2002, West Coast ports became the center of another high-profile labor dispute. Only now, the union men who helped put Jack Block into power began viewing the port commissioner as the enemy.
What were those days like for you? You go to work, this is like the front page, this is all the stations are covering it, trying to look for a bad guy. I'm sure you had a lot of headaches then.
Well, it was very frustrating, and nobody was happy. Normally, everybody works as a team, and it was just very difficult. Nobody knew if they're going to have a job the next day, and they're worried about the union. Guys my age are worried about their pensions.
The lockout shut down 29 major ports from San Diego to Bellingham. Suddenly, shipping trade ground to a halt, costing the economy almost $1 billion a day. Things got so tense, 10 days after the lockout, President Bush invoked the Taft-Hartley Act, forcing management to reopen the ports.
We got just about everything that we wanted, in spite of the militancy expressed by the Mr. Miniacci, the head of the PMA, and came out with a 6-year contract that provides virtually everything that we wanted, with the exception of the clerks.
Despite that seeming victory, the future is not looking good for the unions. According to industry analysts, union membership nationwide has fallen to a 50-year low. In the 1950s, 36% of union workers toiled in the private and public sectors. Today, that number is a mere 13%. Longshoremen fear the heartbeat of a community is dying.
The Longshore Union has long been on the side of helping all workers get better conditions, better jobs, and more jobs.
The Seattle local has had, as I mentioned, African Americans since 1905, and the same for Hispanics. The union is a democracy within itself.
In spite of the fact that I got my foot smashed, my neck broke, all sorts of interesting things went on in the 20-some years, 25 years that I was a longshoreman. I think I enjoyed damn near every minute of it.
So what made the port what it is? Historically, exports of fur, timber, and seafood established trade as a cornerstone of life in Puget Sound.
It's been an international port for South America, Australia, all of these areas. A lot of it related to forest products.
Our close proximity to Asia means the majority of trade flows east, through Seattle.
Designers would send the designs offshore, and they manufacture and then ship them back here, and we're the nearest distribution point, so they distribute through Seattle, and that's how we became kind of the rag center of the Pacific Coast.
But Seattle didn't have a lock on the import-export business in the Northwest. Seattle found a very determined rival in the Port of Tacoma. This economic powerhouse boasts a deep harbor and excellent railroad connections. It could also be cutthroat.
They bought the business in Tacoma very well, and they're very successful at it. But they were very competitive, and they could do it for a lot less.
The whole industry is leapfrogging. Who's going to get ahead of who? And that's been true since 1853, when the first ship loaded in Tacoma and in Seattle.
But in the 1960s, a growing demand for goods and containerization left enough work for both waterfronts. The influx turned Seattle into one of the West Coast's biggest ports. And the railroads built an industrial hub, making it easier to transport products. In 1999, more than 1.5 million containers carrying $40 billion worth of goods passed through the Port of Seattle. Jack says most Seattleites know very little about this economic lifeline.
Oh, I think a lot of people take it for granted. They drive down the viaduct and see some ships and some cranes. It's a pleasant feeling for a lot of people. They just take it in stride. We've got one of the prettiest harbors in the world.
Today, international trade supports 1 out of 4 jobs in Washington state.
This used to be a sand and gravel dock right here, where Edgewater's at now. And it was just a pier falling in the water. And this used to be the Bell Street terminal.
Jack says the port didn't end up this way by accident. It took vision. In 1911, Seattle became the nation's first public port authority, and since then, the port has focused on developing the waterfront. It started by taking over railroad properties and transferring them from the private sector to public space.
This area right in here used to be an old salmon processor cannery right in here. It's falling in the water, and then there was a bunch of old docks. And the docks were all at an angle for the sailing ships so they could come in with it, tack in with the wind.
In the 1980s, the port bought 23 acres of waterfront property. Over the next 15 years, developers reconstructed Piers 64, 65, and 66 to create the Bell Harbor Complex. This is where visitors enjoy a marina, the cruise ship terminal, a conference center, restaurants, and the Odyssey Maritime Discovery Center. Still, critics say it's too much.
There was a period in which the port was basically run by people in the stevedoring industry, and during that period the interest was in building up the port as a seaport. During that period we basically thrived. Over time, the Port Commission has gradually become almost totally inhabited by people from the financial district.
Critics fear the port's desire for money is taking it away from its original mission of building the most efficient cargo industry possible.
It's pretty clear that their interest is not in promoting cargo. Their interest is in real estate, I guess.
The port's newest project won't make the Commission's detractors any happier. The port plans to develop 57 acres behind Terminal 91. The Commission wants to create a new neighborhood called North Bay that includes residential and commercial space.
Again, we're going to have to make changes. Life does not stand still. The longshoremen consider they own the narrow strip of land that faces the waterfront, and I know they've had it that way for years and years.
Block says the port hasn't sold out. He says commissioners still struggle to keep the waterfront from becoming a tourist trap.
But this is what we didn't want. We didn't want a San Francisco fisherman's tour. We wanted people to be able to come down and get to the water and see the water. And that's what we tried to characterize in that whole development.
So you try to avoid the San Francisco model?
Yeah, because you could go down to the waterfront in San Francisco and not even see a fish boat.
But the Commission's critics say Block and the others sold out in an even worse way. In the 1990s, the Port of Seattle fought hard to win a piece of the cruise ship industry.
We were involved in Vancouver, BC, in that activity, and we were pushing, or we were soliciting principals to come into Seattle. They built this facility on spec. It had to be redesigned for the new modern ships.
One of the big mistakes was building the cruise ship too small. Then we had to go back in and make a lot of changes. The ships were on the drawing boards, and by the time we got it built, they were on the scene. And nobody thought we could bring cruise ships into Seattle because of the Passenger Services Act. But we did it finally. The ships got big and fast enough they could make a round trip from Seattle rather than Vancouver in 7 days. And so now on the weekends you'll see these docks full of big cruise ships, biggest in the world.
As vacation cruises grow more popular, the Seattle waterfront is regularly flooded with tourists.
I mean, it's been a blessing for this community, especially with the economy the way it is now. And these people come into town, they stay overnight, 2 or 3 days, and they go home and tell their friends about it, and they come back. And a lot of these cruise ship people are repeats.
According to the Port of Seattle, cruise ships docked only 6 times in 1999. 4 years later, luxury liners made 100 visits, bringing nearly 400,000 people to the waterfront.
I would say that it's adding jobs, definitely adding jobs to this area. Each turnaround vessel generates somewhere around $750,000 to $800,000 income to the local economy, and that's significant.
The cruise ships, these are not commerce. This is froth on the surface of commerce.
The port even converted a container terminal to make room for more cruise ships. That move didn't sit well with union members.
And the idea that it takes a 150-acre dock with 4 cranes to support a cruise ship once a week is patently ridiculous.
Environmentalists aren't thrilled either. They accuse the cruise ships of polluting Elliott Bay. Block says that's not an issue anymore.
They've had a couple of problems with somebody dumping the gray water inside the territorial waters, but now they have systems that take care of all of that.
In fact, Jack says one of his top priorities on the commission was to preserve the environment.
Because I was the first guy talking about environment, and a lot of people down here couldn't even spell it. Yes, we could put in a system of parks and trails and viewpoints, and I supported it right from the beginning.
I'm standing in the heart of Jack Block Park. This is a living legacy to the former Seattle Port Commissioner. Jack prides himself on his efforts to clean up Elliott Bay and to preserve its natural beauty for generations to come.
I mean, this whole area in here was shipyards. And it's all mud flats, and there was just the banana terminal was here. The banana boats come in every Monday, a big white boat.
From where?
Costa Rica.
Jack says his position on the environment often put him in the hot seat.
I was a troublemaker that was arguing for viewpoints and parks and vistas. It's part of my platform when I ran.
Are you going to concentrate on jobs, or are you going to concentrate on our environment? Are you concentrating on the present generation or the next generation? Now, he thinks about those issues. I know he does. I've talked to him about those. And it's a very difficult decision, and you can't get in the middle of it. And yet here you are in the middle, at the port, between the Longshore, between the employers, and between environmentalists and the rest of the world. It's a much more complex thing than 50 years ago.
And that's what it all boils down to. Where can you get the biggest bang for your buck in investment and for the community, and try to fit it in without damaging the environment.
Jack took me on a tour of the park the commission named in his honor in 2001. It came at the end of 28 years of service and at the beginning of some tough personal times.
At that time I was going through a tough period of my life. I just lost my wife and then lose the election, and that was kind of tough.
For years, the dock worker turned port commissioner managed to walk a tight line between the union and management. Block remembers when the union finally decided he had crossed the line.
We had some problems with our maintenance department, and we were losing $4 to $5 million a year. We had 3 jurisdictions, and it just wasn't working out. And I just couldn't honestly not take a position on it. It would have been easy to walk away from it, but I didn't. And I told the unions they were wrong, and so they disagreed with me and booted me out.
And that was probably fundamentally what defeated Jack Block in this last election was that he no longer had the unified support of the trade union movement, including longshoremen.
So don't think that Jack Block is sitting home bitter and full of regrets over his half-century on the waterfront. He's had some health issues. He's currently battling colon cancer, but he's got a new wife. He's working with a couple of charities, and he's returned to the port as a consultant. So the book on one of Seattle's most colorful port commissioners isn't quite closed just yet. For SCCtv, I'm Lowell Deo.
Thank you, Lowell. To learn more about the development of Seattle's waterfront and its rich maritime and labor history, please visit www.historylink.org. For SCCtv, I'm Walt Crowley. I hope you'll join us again when we next remember Seattle.